cigarettes and sugar and coffee and boxes and take it home to your mom. You know, and when they met her, oh, it was mother, how are you, and all that. And then there were some that just hated the Japanese. I thought they shouldn't even be there.
Yeah. I think I'm almost ready. You said you attended school in Nagasaki?
Mm-hmm. I went to a Catholic convent in Nagasaki.
Oh, okay.
I started school in Shanghai, really. And then my health wasn't very good.
Mm-hmm.
And the climate in China wasn't all that good, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why they sent me to Nagasaki. No. Go over there and lie down. Come on, lie down. Down. Be nice. Nicely. Lie down nicely. Good job. You're a sport. You know that? You're a sport. No. No. Do you want to go outside? Huh? Do you want to go outside? Okay, all right, I'll let you go outside. Vicky's there. She can keep you out of the garden, I guess. Vicky? Vicky?
This is June 17th, 1988. My name is Joe Todd, and this is an interview with Sadie Iro Bozeman. We're in Tulsa, but you live in Noble?
No, southeast of Noble. It's a
Southeast.
Lexington address.
Okay. What is your address?
Route 1, Box 134, Lexington. And 73051.
73051. Where were you born?
Burma, in Rangoo.
And when's your birthday?
23rd of September, 1924.
1924. Who is your father?
Herbert George Porter.
Herbert George
Porter.
Porter. And your mother?
Her name was Magna. That's all I know.
M-A-G-N-A.
N.A.
Why were your parents in Burma?
My father had been in the British Army, and he got his retirement there, and he worked for the Oppenheimer oil refineries in safety. And well, when I was about a year old, they went to China. And we lived in Shanghai for a time, and I also spent some time in a little fishing village called Mie. That was
How do you spell the village?
M-I-E is the spelling then, but I think most people spell it M-I-Y-E. It's easier to spell that way. Mie.
Why did your father retire in Burma?
I don't know. I really don't know. He didn't talk much about his own feelings or anything. And I've heard, and I've also read, that a lot of British who go to India and Burma like it, and they just don't ever go back. Mm-hmm. In fact, there were 5 of his ex-service pals who retired in Nagasaki and Mie, and right in that area. They all married Japanese ladies.
And why did the family move to China, Shanghai?
Oh, he got a job there. There were so many foreigners there, Americans and British, and he got a job with a tobacco company, with Tobacco Products Corporation, and he worked there. And he had to retire fairly early in life. His health wasn't good. And in 1935, we left Shanghai and went to Japan. And we lived for a time in Nagasaki. I attended the convent that I had gone to before. And about 1937, my mother decided to move us to the country. I think it was for health purposes, really. So we moved to a village called Iro, and he had a friend there, Mr. Bolus, who was in the army with him. And that's where we were when the war broke out.
Let me back up. Do you have any memories of Burma at all?
No, a year old.
What about Shanghai?
Oh yes, I have memories of Shanghai.
What part of town?
Hongqiu. It's an international settlement.
Now, is that near the downtown area, or is it out from downtown?
It's in the country, but they were broken up in concessions, the British concession, the French concession, and there was a creek, a very smelly creek called Su Chao Creek that separated us from those concessions in Hongqiu. And Hongqiu is really a melting pot. Just about, people from all over the world lived there. And within Hongqiu was also the Chinese settlement of, we used to call it, I can't even remember the name of it. It was a walled city anyway, where the Chinese were, and they had a curfew. They locked the gates at 10 o'clock at night and then opened it again in the morning to let the Chinese out. There were some Chinese living outside of it.
Why a curfew?
I do not know. This, I think this was more for what they call the coolie class, probably. And when the Japanese were there in the early 30s, they used to shell from the Rangoo River and shell this town and get the down, shells would whiz over our heads and some would fall right in Hongqiu.
Why were the Japanese shelling the area?
This is a history that I'm still trying to find out. There was a thing called the Shanghai incident. And I've read so many versions of it. I've heard that there was a Chinaman who killed a Japanese soldier, and that's what caused it. And then I've heard some other versions of it. But I do know they weren't taking over China yet. That came later, after we left. But there was a lot of fighting, and it wasn't safe to go out. My stepmother being Japanese, she was escorted by Japanese Marines, and I remember going to school being escorted by Marines. And foreigners who lived there had their own civilian patrols. My father was one of them. He'd go out and patrol for a while every day. And I was too young to really know what was going on. All I know that there was a lot of shelling going on. And I was going to a convent right next door, and one of the shells fell right on the ground there one day.
Anyone injured by it?
No.
What was the name of the convent in Shanghai?
The convent in Shanghai was called Sisters of Mercy, I think it was.
Could you give me a description of Shanghai as you remember it?
Well, it isn't exotic like a lot of people talked of. It was very smelly, noisy, a lot of beggars, and people starving. And the contrast between the foreigners living there and the Chinese were so different, so much. There's a lot of starvation going on. And if you happened to be a foreigner living there, you'd open the door in the morning, you'd find a dead baby maybe outside. But the Chinese baby had died and the parents couldn't bury it. They didn't have the money to bury it, so they laid it in front of the foreigner's door, hoping that it would be buried. Sometimes you found a coffin with a live baby in it too, and they would be put into orphanages. The convent I went to was also an orphanage. There were some Chinese students there. But noisy. Some nice parts of it. They had some nice parks that we used to go to. And I would very much like to go back there and see. I think that it's probably a lot better now.
I heard it's been cleaned up.
Yes.
What about the streets in Shanghai? Were they paved?
Oh yes, we had streetcars, double-decker buses.
I've often, my whole life, I've wondered why the term being Shanghai.
Shanghai being captured and taken on a ship.
Yeah,
That's,
why the
I
term
don't
Shanghai?
know. Years ago, I think that they didn't have enough men who wanted to be sailors and go on the ships going to the Orient, and that's why they kidnapped them and took them. And a lot of ships went to China, and I imagine that's where the term came from, don't you think?
I suppose. I have no idea, but I've heard that my whole life.
Uh-huh.
What subjects did you study in the convent?
Everything, just about everything. The one in China, because my memories, so faint about the school there. I was shuttled from one school to another. I went to public school, I went to private schools, and then I went to convent, and then I went to Japan, and that are my best memories there.
Did you go to public school in Shanghai?
I did. I started in public school.
Would you compare the public schools to the convent?
Oh gosh, first grade, I can't even remember. My memories in school there are so faint. I spent too much time being shuttled around, and I also had tutors at one time. My father was an odd person, I guess. He felt like if something didn't go right in the school, that school wasn't good enough. He wanted me in another school, and he'd try that school. And I know the private schools were not, the one I went to wasn't very good. It was called Thomas Hambry. They had a teacher there, a male teacher, who was calling from, like one of the teachers from Dickens, Nicholas Nickleby. The punishment was too harsh, and my father took me out of that one. And I had private teachers, and then I'd go to another school. I did like the convent that I went to, Nagasaki. It was a lot of fun in a way.
You say you were shuttled around. How were you shuttled around? What?
To different schools.
I mean, was it by the bus or a car? Or?
No. When I said shuttle around, I mean transferred from one school to another.
Oh, okay.
If the school was far, I went on a rickshaw with my mother. She would take me. And the only school that I remember that was close enough to walk was the convent, because it was right across the street from us, the narrow lane, and there was a convent. And when I first went there, the first day, I remember that, because after class, I started to go out to the gate with all the other children, and when I got to the gate, the sisters wouldn't let me leave. I had to stay, and I wanted to go home. I could see my home right across the lane, and yet I couldn't go, and I found out that I was going to board there. And our dormitory windows opened right onto the lane, and at night I could see my mother standing at the window, and we'd wave to each other. And I found out after I grew up that there had been a kidnap attempt. And that's why they put me there as a boarder. So I didn't stay there very long. I stayed there perhaps for about 5 or 6 months.
A kidnap attempt on?
My stepmother and myself. My father worked for a tobacco company, and he handled all the money. He was the paymaster, and he'd go to the bank to pick up the cash and take it back, and he did this in an armored car with an armed guard. That's how bad things were. There were lots of robberies, and it was not a safe place to live, really. I wasn't allowed to go out alone, never.
What was the currency in Shanghai?
In those days it was dollars.
Dollars.
The odd thing about it was we had a 20-cent piece, and if you had a silver 20-cent piece and changed it, you would get 25 cents for it. 25 pennies.
Huh.
And the pennies were called dompes. Dompes. That was what we used to call them. And they also had what was called cash, money with a square hole in the middle. And for bakery goods, for instance, the bakery truck would come around and leave the bread, but you never paid the driver. You paid the company, and they gave you a string of cash, and you exchanged the bread for the cash. And the cash was like money, but it wasn't really money, so you tendered it for the product. That's what it was. I guess they didn't trust the driver.
If I may ask, when did your father and stepmother marry?
I found a marriage certificate that showed that they were married in 1926 or 27, I can't remember, in Shanghai. But I think that was their second wedding, because I know they were married in Burma, supposedly. See, a lot of my father's papers have disappeared.
What about your natural mother?
He never talked about her. I don't know. You know that marriage between British subject and foreigners, especially Indians, Burmans, and the like, was frowned upon. So if he married her, I don't know, he was probably ostracized.
Was she Burmese?
She was supposed to, my stepmother told me about her years afterwards, that she was Persian. But she had been born in Burma, so the birth certificate states that she is a Burman, a Buddhist. But I had no pictures of her. I don't even know what she looked like. And my father would not talk about her. Maybe he just had a fling. Could be, being a soldier.
And how long did you live in Shanghai?
No. 1926. Not even, about 7, 8 years. Yeah, on and off, because I was sent to Nagasaki to school while my parents were still living there in Shanghai. And I used to go home for Christmas vacations and summer vacations until it got to where I didn't even want to go home anymore. I enjoyed myself too much. I had friends, and there was a freedom there that I'd never had in China, you see. And in Shanghai, I was closeted in this house and in this little space that was the yard, and I wasn't allowed to go out of the gate alone. I much preferred being in Japan.
What is the river that flows through Shanghai?
Yangtze, Rangoo River.
Okay.
The Rangoo River is the big one that goes across the Bund. That's the famous one.
Now, the international delegation, I understand they had Americans in Shanghai also.
Oh, there were Americans there, a lot of missionaries there. In fact, we lived right across the street from a large mission complex, and we could see them up 2-3 stories and watch them.
So you left Shanghai before the Japanese invasion?
Oh, yeah, in 1935. I don't think that the real trouble there started around 1937. But I used to, well, we got the Mainichi newspaper, the English newspaper there, and I used to read about, all the glorious victories that the Japanese army was having over there, you know.
So, would you describe Nagasaki when you were going to school and your parents lived in Shanghai?
Oh, very beautiful city. I would compare it to San Francisco. The hills and the houses, built on the hillside, and the streets, the state. And the sisters used to get very excited and cross themselves as the taxi would go down those hills. They didn't like that. But the convent was built on the hillside too, and we used to be able to see the Mitsubishi shipbuilding complex across the bay and watch the ships being put to sea. And it was a lot of fun there. And
What was the name of the convent?
Sacred Heart Convent.
Sacred
It was
Heart.
called Maria's Orphanage by the Japanese, and They have pictures in these books that you can get from the Japanese government, the tourist division, and it was a very large one, mostly Japanese orphans, and they had a Italian sister and French sisters, Canadian sisters, and English sisters there. And the children there were just a conglomeration. There was a Swiss Japanese, Scottish, American children, Swedish, Koreans, and all foreigners. Most of them lived, the parents lived in China, and they would send their children there. There were a few that lived right there in Nagasaki and would attend that convent. And because they were mostly girls, but we did have one boy, a Portuguese boy, among all of us. And it's almost like a one-room schoolhouse that you had over here years ago, except we had two. And the sisters would teach the different levels because we were all different ages, from kindergarten to high school they would teach.
What language did they teach?
They taught French and English, and the Japanese students were off on their own. We weren't really allowed to speak Japanese.
Oh, you weren't?
No, but we did anyway. We used to sneak around and speak it. And there were three of us the same age. One was English and one was Scottish Japanese and myself. And I guess we got to be, we were called the Three Musketeers. And we learned the other things that women are taught, sewing and embroidery and things like that. And most of us had to learn the history and the monetary systems of our own country. So while the others would study maybe Russian history or American history, I had to learn English history and the monetary system. That's the way they did it. Because we all learned French. I should have paid more attention, I guess.
And why did the family move to Japan?
My father's illness. He was having little strokes for many years and just couldn't hold his job down anymore because he would have the strokes while working. So he was in his late 50s and finally gave up trying to find another job, I guess, and moved to Nagasaki. Because I was happy. I was back at my convent again.
And what part of town did you live in Nagasaki?
Higashiyama. It's, Higashi would be, my Japanese is so bad. I'm going to guess east. We lived on one hill and I had to walk down that hill across town and up the other hill to go to the convent. And the convent was in the Minamiyamate section. And that's where all the famous homes, the foreigners' homes, were a very exclusive part of Nagasaki. They say that one of the houses there was used as a base for Madame Butterfly. And it's so beautiful. We used to go downtown and then get the train, the streetcar, and ride out towards the waterfront where all the consulates were, and then you'd go on back towards Urakami and all the other downtown area. And, well, it was, I can't describe it. It was so beautiful to me. All those little cobbled streets and the bridges. Very historical place.
Has it been rebuilt?
I haven't seen it since it's been rebuilt. I've seen pictures of it. I've written to the Nagasaki prefectural offices to get pictures and descriptions.
Does it look like it did before, or?
Much more colorful. The Japanese houses used to have these gray slates. Except for the exclusive Minamiyamate area, they had beautiful red slates, the foreigners' houses. And the houses itself were very colorful, but the Japanese houses with the wooden shutters and all that, and the slate, you could look up down from the mountainside, and it would just be one mass of gray except for some of the tall concrete buildings. And now the pictures show that they have red, blue, all different kinds of tiles. It's very colorful. And there's been a park built called Peace Park, the site of the atomic bombing. And one of the most famous churches, that Urakami Cathedral, that was destroyed during the war, during the bombing, and that's been rebuilt. I would like to go back and see all that, because our convent wasn't touched, and the church that we used to go wasn't touched.
Well, it wasn't?
No. See, Nagasaki, being so hilly, a lot of it was sheltered from the atomic bombing. A lot of them got radiation, from the first flash, because it does flash before it touches the ground. And that killed a lot. But when it finally did touch and explode, that didn't touch the area where we lived, because it was on the other side of the hills. And the convent wasn't touched, but the sisters who taught us, the foreign sisters, were in the Urakami. There was another convent there, and that's where they had been housed during the war.
Were they protected?
No, they got killed in that blast. Yeah, because I went back. It's the first thing I did when I went back to Nagasaki, was to find out about them. And he said all the foreign sisters had been taken to the mother convent, and that was so close to the epicenter. I always wondered why they chose Nagasaki, at least that area, because I don't think there were any munitions plants there unless they built them right after the war. The Urakami shipbuilding yards was opposite the convent, and that I don't think was destroyed. And then they had another shipbuilding yard on the other side, outside of Nagasaki. I think that was where they had prisoners of war here, because I know my husband had some friends who worked with him who had been kept at the concentration camp, and I know they were outside of Nagasaki there. So I hear that they used them to clean up Nagasaki after the bombing, sent them out. But I wasn't in Nagasaki or that close to Nagasaki. I was about 27 miles out. And I say 27 miles in a straight line from Nagasaki. The trains would take a couple of hours because they'd have to go all over the darn place before they go back that way.
Did you see the flash?
Yes, I did. I was working in a factory, a barrel factory. And that was one thing I had to do during the war, was work, because what my father left me, see, he died right after the war started. And what he left us, my share, was kept frozen. If I needed the money for anything, mostly medical bills, dental bills, I had to send the bill to the Treasury Department, and the money would be sent directly to the doctor, the dentist. So I had to work, and I did a lot of stuff. I worked on the farms, and I worked in a factory making rope from sisal. I guess the hardest work was on the farms. I'd never done work like that.
What type of farm work did you do?
Planted rice the first summer. Planted rice for about 19 or 20 days straight, and I got black. I don't like the leeches either. I am deathly afraid of anything like that. And I did wheat harvesting. I almost cut a part of my finger off with a little short sickle that they had. And I even got to plow, and guide the ox. I'd never done anything like that before. And I worked for a lumber mill, hauling lumber up the mountains. And it was mostly women who did the work.
What were you using to haul the lumber?
What do they call those things that there's a big stand and you put poles in and you turn a turnstile? I have no idea what they called them. We would push against the poles and walk around, and that would hold a chain or the rope up.
Oh, okay.
There were the logs.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have no idea what you call those things. There must be a name for it. And when the atomic bomb fell, we were in Mie by that time, and I'd been working in Shimabara, which is about, I would say about 7 or 8 miles from Shimabara, from our village that we lived in. And we had our tea break, mid-morning tea break, and the alarm sounded, and we always thought it was a lark because we could get off work and we'd go into the shelter. And, well, we just about got in the shelter when the all clear sounded. So we went out, and instead of going back to work, we stood around looking up in the sky to see if we could find a plane anywhere, and just taking our time, not wanting to go back to work right away. And there was a plane. We saw a plane, and we saw a parachute come out of it and open up. And the parachute was coming there, and all of a sudden, while watching the parachute, all of a sudden, behind the mountains, you could see this huge just flash. And you couldn't describe it. It was so brilliant. And we knew that something had happened because we heard about this Genshi Bakudan, they called the atomic bomb. And I didn't know the English meaning for it because it was a new term. And we heard that Hiroshima had been destroyed. Well, this was just rumor. And on the radio you didn't hear much, just that a bomb had dropped and Hiroshima had been bombed. But we heard rumors about Hiroshima having been decimated. There was nothing left and all that sort. But you know, you couldn't visualize something like that. I mean, we'd seen bombs coming down, and incendiaries, but we'd never seen anything like that before, or heard of anything like that before. And we just couldn't even visualize something like that happening. So when the splash went off, we knew that something terrible had happened, and we just stood around, what? And all of a sudden, here were these black clouds, I mean, just huge clouds, and you knew that something was burning because it was orange, purple, terrible colors, you know. And somebody came out and said that Nagasaki had been bombed by this terrible Genshi Bakudan, and that Nagasaki was no more. It was just flattened, and we couldn't believe it. And, well, everybody had friends and relatives then. My stepmother had relatives then. I had my friends and the sisters at the convent. And we couldn't even imagine what could have happened. But it took about 2 hours by train from Nagasaki to Shimabara. And a little over 2 hours later, you know, over the loudspeaker, they're saying, there's some wounded from Nagasaki at the station, so would you please go and help? They need help. So we went, and I went along with them, and we walked in the station, and you couldn't believe what you saw there. Well, I had seen dead people before, and wounded, but nothing like this. They were just, some of them were half dead already. They were just laying there and just moaning. And the odd thing about it, nobody was crying or shouting. You know, if you've ever seen a disaster, you'll hear people screaming, hollering, shouting. But they weren't doing that. They were either just lying there, or some of them were moaning. And some of them, help, please help. And a lot of them just lost control of their bodily functions. They had no feeling. Well, we helped any way we could, giving them water and things, but what else could we do? We didn't know what to do. Well, there were some doctors and nurses around there, but I don't think they really knew what to do. I have an idea that most of those people there died. I mean, they were just massive raw flesh, just, well, you've seen raw flesh. I can't even describe it. And skin just peeling and hanging off. And I heard that that was one of the effects of that bomb. If you was exposed to it, your skin just fell off. You could just put your hand on it and it would just rub off. And, well, it's indescribable.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I won't ever forget. When I first came to Oklahoma and went to the state fair, there were pictures of us in the fair. They had a section there showing pictures of the bombing and victims, and I started crying and I had to leave. It was so terrible. That's it. And I went to Nagasaki a couple of days afterwards, because my stepmother went the day after, because she was worried about her friends, and after she heard me tell her what I'd seen, she just couldn't stand it anymore. But she couldn't stay. She said she went there and she came right back. She said, I just couldn't take it. And I went 2 days later, and I didn't go openly. I had to sneak there, and I just couldn't believe it either. I mean, it was like a strange place. It wasn't Nagasaki to me anymore. There was no landmarks, and the trees and utility poles were just stumps left. Everything was just burnt, flush, gone on top of that. And streetcars would just stop where they had been, and dead inside, all burnt, crisp. And there was a huge fish market near the station. It was built of steel, and the whole thing looked like one big pretzel, just bent. I couldn't stand it either. I just gave up and went home. It smelled too bad, and the scene was just too horrible. So I went home and went back right after Japan surrendered again. And it had been cleaned up somewhat then, so it was a lot easier to take. But I just hope that there'll never be another war like that again. No more atomic bombs, anyway.
How many died at Nagasaki?
I've got the figures. Thousands and thousands, and killed initially, and then later on from radiation sickness. My mother was one of them. She'd gone too soon, And I've had a few problems, and they wondered whether it was caused by my going there too soon. I've been tested for it. So far, I'm all right. My thyroid doesn't function.
So your mother died of radiation?
Yes, she died of that. She didn't die until 1947, but she was in a lot of pain by then, and I never got to her in time. I was working away from home, and by the time I heard she was ill and took off to go home, she had died already. And after I left, there was a telegram delivered saying she had died. So I got home and found the house locked up and couldn't get in, and here comes a little child from the village, and I asked her where Auntie, everybody called her Auntie, where was Auntie? And she said, oh, she's dead. And that's how I found out. So it was painful.
Was that in Nagasaki?
No, this was in Shimabara. She went to a hospital in Shimabara. Her home was in Mie. She lived there still. My dad built a house for her right on the bluff looking down the ocean, the bay. I guess I was very lucky because I've been told that that's where the invasion was slated to take place. And I used to ask my husband, I said, if you'd come ashore there and seen me, would you have shot me first or asked me first or otherwise?
When the war started, let me see, it started in
1941.
Well, I mean,
December.
that was when the attack on Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese invasion of China was 37.
About that, 37, 38, sometime.
What was your
about there.
reaction to that?
I really had no reaction to that. Until I got involved more or less in the war. See, I would read about the Japanese invasion of China, and like I said, I had no reactions to it. It didn't involve me, and it was after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and about a week to 10 days after the attack, we had military police came to our house from the headquarters in Nagasaki. I thought they came to talk to my father. They took me instead. I got taken with them. And I was taken to the headquarters in Nagasaki, and I was kept there for a week with interrogations. They treated me very nicely. They offered me tea and cakes and asked me all kinds of stupid questions. Like Mr. 17 years old, what could I tell them?
What question did they ask?
The kinds of questions they asked was, the meaning of a word in English. What does it mean in Japanese? And I'm sure they knew all along what it was. They were just asking me, I don't know, put me at ease or whatever. And then they would ask me, how many aircraft does Britain have? How many warships do they have? And things like that. How would I know? I had never gone to England even. But later on, my mother told me that it was because I had left home many times. I didn't get along with my father. He was a very, very strict man, and I used to, what you call run away nowadays, I guess. I'd leave home and go and stay at the British consulate in Nagasaki. So I got very friendly with them. And maybe the Japanese thought that I was there for some reason, militarily or something, that I knew more than I said I knew, but I didn't. I just went there for shelter.
When did the war begin between Japan and Great Britain?
Well, I don't know. Wasn't it about the following year after Pearl Harbor?
No, it was before, wasn't it? Wasn't it in 39 or 40?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
No. Because Pearl Harbor, to me, was, well, I'm English, and that's America. It doesn't involve us. That's, the way I felt. And my father never spoke much about it, but then I realized that Britain was involved in it when they started taking the British territories, Burma, and all those areas. And they showed movies of them in all the villages, and I had to go and view them. Then I realized, hey, English, that's English. We're involved too. And my feelings changed from then, Until then, I didn't feel much about anything. Because I didn't know a lot of Americans. A few missionaries and one couple in China that we knew. And it was so distant. But when I saw those films and started hearing about the British being captured and all, that's when I realized that we were involved also, and my feelings changed. And when the bombers used to come over, I used to go out. I used to drag the laundry out when we got a warning and hang all the laundry out. We weren't supposed to. We were supposed to take them down. And I used to hang them out, and I said, please, God, send all those bombs down. I want you to bomb this place. Drop a lot of bombs. I felt that the more bombs, the quicker the war would end. I was getting rather desperate. after a few years, I thought, I'm not ever going to get out of Japan. I'm going to die here. And to me, that was the most terrible thought. I wanted to go to England. I wanted to see my uncles and aunts and my cousins. I'd never met them, just written to them. And they were my only family. I didn't have any family anymore other than them. My stepmother was my last, to me. Her nephews and nieces, we got along, but they weren't my family. That's the way I felt. And one of her sisters definitely didn't like me. She said, she's not your mother, after she died. And she told me I should leave the house because it wasn't my house. So my ties were all in England. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. My going there, I came here instead.
What was the reaction of just the Japanese? No, were you a British subject at this time?
Yes.
What was the reaction of just the Japanese people toward you being a British subject?
I was raised, I spent so much time there, and I spoke like a native. And I never said anything, against the Japanese. I wouldn't have dared. They used to tease me a lot. They used to tease me and say, what if, you saw B-29 and we'd see a B-29 shot down. They'd say, what if we went out there and we caught the pilot and the other people in there? What would you do? Would you grab a pitchfork or a knife and go after them the way we would? And I'd say, well, they're Americans. I'm English. That's the way I got away with it. See? And that's the only way I was teased. Most of the people were very kind to me because my stepmother was loved. Everybody loved her. She was that kind of a person. She was kind, and she never said any bad things about anyone. She helped people. And because of that, I think I was better treated. They wanted to put me in a concentration camp right away. But she stood up for me, and she's only a kid. Don't let them take them. And I guess she bribed the local policeman. Coffee and sugar and condensed milk that they loved, and she would give those things to them and ask them to please don't let the Kempeitai take her. And finally I was allowed to, but they said that when I reached 21 I would have to go. I wouldn't be allowed to stay with her then. So I was very lucky because the war ended a month before my 21st birthday.
Where did they take the Americans and the British concentration camps?
There was a concentration camp near Isahaya, which was a terminal where all the trains would go through and you made your changes there. And my stepmother, I had never gone anywhere beyond our village towards Isahaya or Nagasaki until after the atomic bomb. And she used to come home and she would cry and tell me that even in winter the men were out there without shoes or warm clothing. And I have an idea they were building an airstrip or something, that they were made to work out there. And then the other one I knew of was Nagasaki, on the west end of Nagasaki, I would say, because a friend of mine who lived in Nagasaki used to work there. She was a Japanese subject, and she worked there, and she told me that she used to smuggle fruit and things to them. But those were the only two that I knew of. They were building an airstrip on the hills of Shimabara, and I had to go there and work. And after the war, the Marines, I guess they were snooping around trying to find out what kind of munitions factories and things were. Nobody told them about that airstrip until I happened to mention it, accidentally, really. And they went after them then, because nobody had told them about it. See? Well, that's the only place I know of in Shimabara that had anything to do with the war. If there were any munitions factories, I didn't know about it because I wasn't allowed anywhere near those.
The Japanese war effort, the people supporting the war. Did you support? Did you work for the war effort, in the war effort?
No, no. The only thing I ever did was if some of the local people would come around with these, they call them hachimaki. The Japanese soldiers wore them around the middles. And it was supposed to be good luck if there were 99 people, women, who did 99 stitches on them. See, there were 99 stitches done by everybody. And if a local citizen brought one and asked my mother and me to make a stitch on there, I would do that. But that's about all. They wouldn't let me do anything else. So I was kept pretty well confined to the village where I lived in. If I wanted to do anything or go anything outside of there, I had to get permission.
What was the reaction of the local people to Pearl Harbor?
The older generation shocked. I don't think that they even thought their Army or Air Force had the nerve to do something like that, attack such a great country. That's what they all said, but after the war started, well, they were all for sending everybody, the men. And the children were let out of school to help on the farms when there was harvesting and things to be done on the farms because the men were gone. But I'll tell you that the farmers made sure that they had enough food for their family and to sell on the black market because the government would come and I don't know whether they just took the grain from the farmers or paid them for it. I'm sure they had to pay something. And they would take them, but if the farmers had, let's say, 20 bales of rice, they would only say they had 17 or 18 and hide the rest. They wouldn't give the government all of their food. And it was against the law to go and buy stuff on the black market, but the trains used to be full with people from the cities. They'd come and ask for rice, potatoes, anything they could get. And my mother told me of an incident that she saw in Nagasaki that she thought was so funny. The civil police and the Kempe time, the military police, never got along. They did not like each other. And she said that she saw a Japanese lady one day with children on both sides and a big bag on her back, but made to look like a baby, covered up, see. And the military police were at the station checking people, but they didn't check this woman because she had children and another baby on her back. And the civil police was standing there, happened to notice that it wasn't a baby. He could tell over this cover she had. And he looked, and the policeman pulled down the cover over this bag and said, "Now take care of your baby," and patted her and sent her on her way. And the military police standing close by, and my mother laughed, and she thought it was so funny. The woman had got away with it. But that's the way things were. And we used to see a lot of people come around. And after we moved from this village of Ino, where we'd been living when the war started, and moved to my mother's hometown village of Mir, it was even more so because we were right the first house on the bluff, and people would come up and stream through into the village, the farmers. And another thing was being right there, we could see all the bombing that was going on across the bay, the coal mines and industrial cities over there. And before the atomic bombing, like early summer, B-29s would come over every night, and the coast would be a mass of flames. It would start on one end and just go all the way across. It would just come on wave after wave after wave. and there'd be refugees the next day coming in boats, all sizes of boats. They'd come across and beg for food and clothing and shelter because they lost everything. I felt sorry for those people because I felt like they were victims just like me.
What was your reaction when you saw all the bombing?
I was happy. The more bombings, the quicker the war would end, and I'd get out of there. My life was at a standstill. My education was at a standstill. And there was nothing. No family except my mother. And my tie with Japan ended with her. And I was glad I would stand there and watch and just be so happy. I didn't dare tell anybody how I felt. But I used to pray for more bombings. It never, never once did it dawn on me, hey, there were kids being killed, innocent people being killed in those bombings. I never thought of that. Not until after I saw what happened in Nagasaki. Then it hit me, hey, people got killed in wars, innocent people. And I guess my feeling towards wars have changed because of that. I still support the military, definitely, because the country's got to have one as long as the world is the way it is. Without a strong army here, we'd be trampled on in no time.
What did you do the day the war ended?
I was outside digging a shelter for the first time. A little trench with a shovel. What it would have done if we got there, I don't know. It got bombed on, probably got killed anyway. But I stood outside when Mother came and told me that the war was over. We both stood there and we both cried. She was happy. She was sad that her country had lost, naturally. But she was glad the war ended, and I felt such relief. I didn't believe it was over. I couldn't. I stood there and I cried, and I said, no, it just couldn't be over. I couldn't believe that it was. It's such a relief, though. So when I went to Nagasaki right away, the first thing I saw was an American Marine in a Jeep, and he toot, 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 I guess he was happy too, and he just stopped right next to me and handed me a bundle of, I don't know what, cigarettes, coffee, sea rations, just the armload. He just threw it at me, and I said, I don't want it. And he said, no, take it, I've got more. And he just took off. He was so happy. He was just handing out these things to everybody he saw. And I couldn't believe it. But then I knew, of course, that, hey, the war really ended. Here come the Americans.
What did Nagasaki look like at that time?
When the war ended, oh, it was still a terrible place. Tin shacks, hastily put out, and they hadn't really cleaned up everything that much, because there weren't any bodies around anymore. All that was cleaned up quickly. But the area that wasn't touched was the way it was before, the way I remembered it. But the area that had been devastated was just rubble, piles of rubble still, and tin shacks where people were living in. And I saw a friend of my dad's rummaging in a garbage can outside the military tent. I think he'd had a really bad time because he was not normal anymore after the war. He didn't even know me. And
was he there for the bombing?
He was in one of the concentration camps. So I saw him and another gentleman that we knew at the Kempeitai headquarters, because we all had to sleep in this one huge room with soldiers and foreigners on straw mats. And they were in there, but I couldn't even go near them or say hello or even wave to them. And they wouldn't even look towards me. They
Why?
were just afraid to acknowledge that they knew me, I guess, because I was there. I mean, what what were they thinking? Here, instead of my father, I am. You know? Maybe they thought I got caught spying or something. They wouldn't look towards me. So this old gentleman was out of his mind, and even though there was food, he was going and digging in garbage cans looking for it. The hunger, the remembrance of hunger never left him, I guess. You know. And we didn't fare too badly, but we still didn't have a lot. And most of the time I ate a little bit of rice with mostly sweet potatoes or peas thrown in it. And fish that used to be so plentiful, we didn't even have a lot of that. And hardly any meat. I think my mother said some of the meat was horse meat half the time. And vegetables, well, the farmers grew vegetables, so we could get that. But I remember the times when we had supposedly smoked fish that was full of maggots. And my mother used to wash rice that had spoiled and tried to camouflage it with all kinds of vegetables and stuff, but I couldn't eat it. I didn't have a very strong stomach, and if something didn't smell right, I couldn't eat it. And I'm still like that even today. It's from that time.
Is the house still in Nagasaki that your father built?
Oh, my father didn't build a house in Nagasaki. We rented. I imagine that's still there, but the house in Mie would probably be there. My stepmother didn't have any children of her own. She adopted one of her brother's sons to carry on her Japanese name. She had dual citizenship, see. And the house went to him. I never even thought that I could have inherited it or anything. It wasn't, I wasn't interested in it. So I imagine it's still there, and he's 7 years older than me, and if his health held out, he's probably still there.
You ever thought about going back to that area?
Oh yes, I would like to. My father is buried in Japan, and yeah, even though we didn't get along, I suppose I still would like to go there. And I would like now, at my age, I would like to find out more. See, those days I had no interest in finding out anything about the past, and now I'm interested, and I would like to go back and find out more. She had some sisters and brothers, but I'm sure that they're all dead. But maybe some of my step-cousins might have an idea. Maybe there were some old letters among her things that I never knew of.
You mentioned that she burned a lot of photographs and everything. Tell me what happened.
Well, she was frightened after the war broke out, and she was scared that the military police might come and search our place and find any of the stuff that she had, pictures of British military installations and my father in uniform and all that. I'm sure they knew that he had been in the army, and all they had to do was dig a little bit and find that out. But she just wasn't going to take any chances. I wish we could have sorted the pictures out and let it destroy what really might have been bad to have. But other than that, photographs of my father's side of the family, you know, and of us. Yeah, I have 2 or 3 pictures of myself as a child and my father, and nothing of the house in Burma. And I know we had pictures because I'd seen them. I used to love to go through this great big packet and stack of pictures and just go through them and look through them all the time. That was something that really interested me. So we have nothing. Some of my cousins sent me a picture of the refinery that my father worked at. I'm hoping to contact them and try and get some more pictures, though.
Where do they live?
My cousins? Oh, mostly retired. They're all older than me. I have some that are in their 80s already.
But they live in England?
Uh-huh.
What part of England?
Well, they're scattered. I've got a cousin in Brighton, and she's come to visit us, and I found out that she used to come to America all the time, and we just didn't know about it. And the other cousins, some of them are in London, in a town called Walthamstow, and Harlow, and I've been once already. I've managed to go once. I lost touch of them. After the war, I couldn't find them. I tried to. And when my daughter got married, her husband was working in Iran at that time. And so for their honeymoon, they went to England, and I gave her an old address that I had. And I said, would you please see if you can find my cousins? And I think they spent a couple of days hunting. And by sheer luck, they found one of my cousins, and through that I found the others. But there's still one part of the family that nobody seems to know what happened. My father had 3 sisters, and none of them married, and he had 3 brothers, or 4 brothers, and one died without marrying. But I found children of 2 of my uncles, and the others, we don't know what happened. I've asked them, and they don't even know. They've just lost touch. Right there in England, they've lost touch. But I met all the others. And of course, my uncles and aunts are gone now. But I did try to locate them after the war, but my letters kept coming back. They'd moved, and it was just the fact that they moved just around the corner. I still couldn't find them, so I'm lucky that I managed to meet them once at least. I'd like to go back again one day. But,
And when did you come to the United States?
1956, December the 1st, 1956.
And why did you come to the States?
My husband, he was sent back. He was stationed over there.
Where'd you meet him?
In Fukuoka, Japan. I was working for the military government, the army, the military government. And he happened to be sent there, and we met there. And he was from New York, but he didn't go back to New York. He wanted to attend, well, he was sent to the Oklahoma military complement in Oklahoma City. And that's where we came. The 11th of December that year, we came to Oklahoma City, and I think they just had the biggest snowstorm of I don't know how many years, because I remember coming into Oklahoma City and it was dark, and there was snow piled everywhere. I haven't seen that much snow in Oklahoma since. It was there to welcome us, I think. And we lived there for, let's see, from 1956, December to December 1957. Then he got riffed. Being military, I guess you know what that means. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he was riffed, and he had a choice of either retiring or becoming a sergeant, and that's what he did, because he had 3 more years to go before retirement. So he was sent to Ada. They sent him to Ada, and we lived in Ada for 3 years until he retired. And then he wanted to attend the University of Oklahoma. He knew Dr. Buchanan there in Asian Studies, and that's how we ended in Norman. And we lived there until 1956 in Norman. Then he was working towards his PhD then, and he decided he better go to work for a while. The money was running out, his GI Bill ran out. And we had a small business that we had started in Japan, an import-export business, and we had that to supplement his retirement. So he went to school, and then he got the position as an assistant professor of Asian Studies, and we went to Magnolia, Arkansas. But I guess it wasn't to be, because we were in Magnolia, Arkansas from 66, and he died in 1968, early 1968. So he didn't really get to finish his PhD or anything that he really was aiming for. And I was unsettled. I didn't really have a lot of friends. I had a lot of acquaintances, but a year and a half you don't make that many friends, I don't think. But I did have some very good friends in Minnesota that I'd met him in Japan, and I knew his family. So I went to Minnesota, and I decided to spend a couple of years in Minnesota to try and find myself, I might say. I guess everything was such an upheaval when he died because it was pretty sudden. And so I went to Minnesota, and it took me 2 years to straighten out my life. And when I did, I decided, well, Oklahoma was the place for me. My friends were there, and my oldest son was living there. So back I came to Norman, Oklahoma. That's where I met Andy, my present husband.
What was your first husband's name?
Fleming, Ernest A. Fleming, F-L-E-M-I-G, unusual spelling.
And you live, I guess, between Noble and Lexington now?
It's southeast of Noble. Are you familiar with that area?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, there's an old place, there used to be a little store there called McKittyville. And it's 1 mile north and 1 mile east of McKittyville. There used to be a school called Spring Hill School. The people called it Wildcat School for some reason or other. And it's near there. We have 15 acres. No animals. We tried keeping cows and sheep, and we had horses at one time. But the children are all gone, now married, and I've got 1 in Oklahoma City and 4 in Norman. And Vicki, my only daughter, is here. I've got 1 in Alaska and 1 in Minnesota. So they're scattered. And I suppose one of these days we'll have to give up that 15 acres and move to town. It's getting harder and harder every year to take care of it.
Any other stories you'd like to relate about Shanghai, Japan?
Oh, the fact that Shanghai, to me, all I can remember of it was the poor Chinese people. That's the way I felt. They were being exploited, used by the foreigners. And
what were the foreigners doing to use the Chinese? What were they doing?
well, made fun of them for one thing. Called them chinks, and just made fun of them. It was their country, but they had nothing. They lived in poverty, they starved, and the missionaries, I guess the intentions were good, and I'm sure that a lot of the missionaries who lived out in the countryside were doing a lot more than the ones that lived in China, because the ones who lived in Shanghai were living high. And the Chinese, well, they did the menial tasks. They were the house boys, the coolies that cleaned out the foreigners' bathrooms. Most of the houses didn't have flush toilets those days. They had commodes. They had to be emptied every day, and that was the Chinese army or the coolies' job to do. And the farmers would come in the sampans, and they lived on the sampans, most of them, and they would take the stuff that was carted to the river by one coolie and transfer it to the sampans, and the sampans would take them out and sell it to the farmers. That's the way they lived. It was a mass of noisy, crying, hollering, shouting humanity. That, to me, that's how I remember it. And when the communists took over, and after I became an adult and I learned more about it, I realized that communism is bad. It's not a way of life for us, but for the Chinese, I think there was some good that came out of it. They were fed, they were educated, And you know, there must have been one in 100 maybe were educated in those days. I couldn't afford to go to schools. My Amma was divorced and she had one daughter, and my mother sent her to the school next door, the convent where I was going, and paid for her education. And that Amma was so grateful that when we left China, she wanted to come with us to Japan. She offered to work for nothing just so she could be with us. And the Chinese people, I think that when you make friends with them, they're a friend for life. And my mother said the same thing, and she was Japanese, and you know, Japanese and Chinese didn't get along that well, most of them. But she always said the Chinese people are the most faithful people.
Was she
They
allowed
won't
to come
stab
to
you in
Japan?
the back. I bet you can't. I bet
Was
you
she allowed to come to Japan?
No, my mother said that we just couldn't. 'Cause, let's face it, our lifestyle was going to change completely. You know, from having a good job to having servants. All of a sudden, he didn't have a job. However long he was going to live, he would have to live on what he had earned and saved. So we didn't have servants after we left Shanghai. And for the first time in my life, I guess at 12, I realized there was such a thing called housework and doing dishes. And then from that, after the war, I realized that there was a lot harder work than housework.
What type of clothes did you wear in Shanghai and Japan?
Oh, in Shanghai, Western clothes. And when we lived in China, it was no store clothes. I don't remember ever going to a store with my mother and buying something off the rack or shoes off the rack. It was ready-made, specially made shoes. And the tailor used to come to our house every so often, measure us for clothing. And until I went to school, I was spoiled. I was very spoiled. I had nice, soft silk clothes. And when I started going to the convent, I had to wear this heavy woolen uniform and dress like everybody else. We wore sailor suits. Navy blue, wool in the winter. In the summer, it was white. But I didn't like it. It scratched me. The wool was heavy, and my mother would tell me about the days when I was little and come home from school without some of my clothing. And she would ask me what happened and say, well, so-and-so didn't have any, so I gave mine to her. I don't know whether that was just an excuse to get rid of scratchy clothes.
What was your average day in the convent in Nagasaki?
Oh, up early in the morning, go to Mass. There was a little chapel in the convent. And then we'd go for breakfast and have classes. We'd spend an hour at this or an hour at something else. It was English and history and science and French. And towards the evening, we had our sewing classes, we used to call it, that we used to enjoy. We had a choice of doing whatever we wanted to in the way of knitting, crocheting, embroidery. And the sister would read to us. And when I got through with my project, I was allowed to read. And that, I guess that was my favorite subject, reading and history. In history, usually I was way ahead of all the other classes because I would sit there, and if we were finished with a certain area, I would just keep on reading to myself, and through my lessons I was allowed to read. I would sit there and just read and read and read, and I would be off on my own then. And it seemed like there was nobody else in the room with me. I was alone, off wherever the article was taking me, and I really enjoyed history. And so if I got to choose a book to read to the class, it was usually historical, something historical.
What type of food did you have at the convent?
Western food. The sisters had a farm up on the mountains, and a Japanese farmer took care of it. So we had rabbit, we had fresh milk, And those cheese that the sisters used to make themselves, the French sister used to make the cheese, as she remembered it, I guess. And we had fresh vegetables, so the food was very good. Best ever, I would say, even from China, because I don't remember having fresh milk in China even. In those days, I don't think they pasteurized milk, and I remember, a man with a horse ringing a bell, selling horse milk, and if somebody wanted to buy it, they'd stop the man, but it was mostly canned milk, so the fresh milk was really good. And we had Thursday afternoons off, and if the weather was good, we would go on long walks, picnics, and a lot of times we went up to the mountains to the farm, and I really enjoyed that. It was so nice. And Sundays, Mass in the morning, we would all get dressed up and walk, and it must have been about 4 miles maybe to the church. And in the afternoons we had the Angelus. We used to go sometimes. And that was a typical day for us, and we would have our time out in the morning. Mid-morning we were allowed about an hour, and then it was noon. And it was Western style food, not Japanese food at the convent, not at all. And evenings, we had to study. We had what we called homework, even in the convent, where we had to study in the evenings. And then the sister would tell us stories or read before we had to go to bed. We had outdoor toilets, though, at the convent. And at night, after it got dark, we didn't want to go out alone. We'd all go out together, make sure everyone had someone to go out with. And we had one toilet upstairs on the second floor, and that was reserved for anybody who was sick. Otherwise, we had to go outside.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the sisters' names that you remember?
Sister Selena was the Canadian sister. Sister Therese was my favorite. She was the English. She was my English teacher, my history teacher, and she was my music teacher. I think she's the one that shaped my life, other than my stepmother. She was loving and patient. She was also very mischievous. I think that's why we understood each other very well, because I was a tomboy, and when I went to the convent in Nagasaki, I think I became a different person. I'd been sheltered until then, not allowed to mix with anybody else. The friends I made at school, I got in touch at school. Outside of the school, I never got to meet them. So here I was free with the other children, not really constricted except on the grounds. And I just went hog wild, and I became a tomboy. I drove the sisters nuts. And Sister Teresa and Sister Selena were the only two that really understood me. And she taught me to love and really enjoy life. Get to really enjoy things. And when she died, I felt I had lost a sister, a very dear friend.
Was she killed in the bomb?
Yes.
What part of Canada was Sister Teresa from?
I don't know. Sister Teresa was English. Sister Selena was Canadian. But where they were from, I don't know. That's all I remember. And then we had the French teacher, Mother Anselme, that was her name. And she was, I'm sure she was just as good as the other sisters, only we kids didn't really understand her. She spoke French, and she spoke Japanese, and she would not speak English. She made us talk to her in French, and we would try to talk to her in Japanese instead. But she was a no-nonsense teacher.
How do you spell her name?
Anselme, Anselm, I guess that would be.
A-N?
E-N, E-L-N, Anselme.
A-N-S-E-L-M?
I think so.
Where is she from?
France. We never really talked about where they were from or anything. She just taught the French class, and that was it. She was the one who worked in the kitchen a lot, made the cheese. And when I first went there, the Mother Superior's name was Mother Epiphany, and she died. And that was my first contact with a dead person. She was laid out, and we had to all go in troop in, and here I'm 7.5 years old, and I'm quaking with all the other children. You know? We'd never seen a dead person before, and I think we all thought she would sit up and shake her hand at us. And where Mother Epiphany was from, I don't know, but it sounds almost as though she could have been English. But I didn't have much contact with her. And the one who took over after her was, she was Italian, and I cannot even remember her name. But they were very nice. And I used to get into mischief and do things that I shouldn't do.
Like what?
Fight with the other children, tear their hair out, and just, I had a terrible temper. And when we fought, we got on the ground and fought. And I'd be punished. And my punishment was that I would have to go into the sisters' quarters, and here were all these about 15 sisters sitting around doing various works of embroidery and praying, and I would have to stand on a bench right in the middle of the room. And I would make faces and do things. And the sisters would usually start laughing. I was a real comic. And other times, if I did something that I shouldn't do, I was naughty, I was sent into the Japanese classroom, about 50 Japanese students and a Japanese teacher, their sister, and I would do all kinds of things, standing in the middle of the room being punished, and I would laugh and giggle and dance on the chairs, and they would all end up laughing too.
What order were the sisters?
No, I don't know. I know that the habits were different entirely from the one in Shanghai. The Shanghai sisters used to have a bonnet with a little frill in front. But the sisters I'm trying to think where I have seen that habit. We call them Sisters of the Sacred Heart, and they had this wide, what we used to call a bib, white starched bib in front, and they had this little starched piece that went across their face and came out almost like a, what would you call it, a hood?
Blinders or?
Yeah, something like that, with the veils, and they stick the pins in the veils. We used to think that they stuck the pins into the head to keep the veils from flying out. But whatever the order they were a lot more open than the sisters in China. The sisters in China were the real Sisters of Mercy. They went out actually and begged, for food and whatever. But these sisters, I guess the foreign community kept them supplied with enough students, and since it was a private school, I have no idea what the tuition was.
Were all the sisters killed in the bombing?
Just the foreign sisters, I believe. I only asked about the two that were my favorites, but I'm sure the others had to be there too, because all the foreign sisters, there were, Mother Anselm, Teresa, Selena, and this Italian. All the others were Japanese, and the convent was used as a hospital by the Japanese army during the war. And I guess the sisters had to stay there and tend to them. But there weren't any other foreign sisters, just those. They were a bunch of fun-loving sisters. We used to go out there and they'd play ball with us and race with us.
You have any photographs of the sisters?
No, I don't. No. We didn't have cameras those days.
Yeah.
If we wanted pictures, we had to get photographers,
Yeah.
you know. I have hardly anything left from my childhood. I stored most of my stuff, books and things. I had a set of Charles Dickens and a lot of other books that I lived on, and I stored them at a military storage place when I was working, because I was moving so much. And I went back to retrieve my stuff and was told that everything had been destroyed in a fire. So I lost everything, my school papers and all my books and all things that I had treasured, mementos I had. I had a couple of footlockers full, and they were all gone. I don't know whether it was destroyed actually in a fire or whether somebody decided to, help themselves to it.
Well, anything else? Any other?
No, I can't think of anything else. There's so many little things that happened.
Anything in particular that...
I was a very sad person when I left Shanghai alone the first time. I remember that. Being
Tell me
on the
about the
ship.
trip from Shanghai to Japan.
Well, it was an overnight trip by one of the smaller steamships. They had a NHK line, I think it's called. Had two ships, Shanghai Maru and Nagasaki Maru. And they just plied from Nagasaki to Shanghai. And it's an overnight trip, and I made the trips alone. I was put in the care of the stewardesses. And I remember my first time, I was fine as long as we were there and the streamers were being thrown, and they always played Auld Lang Syne. And after the ship started sailing away and you couldn't see the dock anymore, and I went back to my cabin, I had this cabin all to myself, and I'd listen to the Auld Lang Syne laying on the bunk, and suddenly I would start crying, and I cried, and I cried, and I didn't care who could hear me. I screamed, I think. And this lady who was in the next cabin came to my cabin to see what was going on. She turned out to be an American lady called Mrs. Smith. I remember that. And she was so angry that I had been left alone. And she got the stewardess and insisted on having me put in her cabin. And she kept me company. She was so nice. And every time I made the trip, about 4 times a year, and every time I went, I used to look around hoping I'd see her again. After that first time, I got used to it, though. And it got to the point after the first year, I didn't want to go back to Shanghai anymore. I
What was
wanted
your
to
reaction when
stay.
you first went to Nagasaki?
Well, nothing different really, because I'd been to Japan before. It wasn't a new thing, see, but I had been with my parents, because my father used to go to Japan on summer vacations, his holidays. They wouldn't stay in Shanghai. A lot of foreigners just went to Japan, to the mountains, and he used to take me to this place called Unsen. It was a very popular resort, a national park, a resort with hot springs, and it was about 30 miles from Nagasaki probably. And we used to spend the summers there. And when he had to go back to work, my mother would take me over to the village to spend the rest of the summer there, and then go back. I would be taken to school in the fall, and she would go back to Shanghai. So Japan wasn't anything new to me. I'd been to Nagasaki
Did you
before.
speak Japanese at that time?
Yeah, like a native. In fact, I picked up the native dialect. The dialect over there is just like the dialect here or in England. Every town or every section has its own dialect. And I had picked up the dialect of her village. So when we went Nagasaki the first time, I started sprouting out in this dialect, and my mother was so shocked because the people just don't do that. You use a different dialect when you go to the cities. In the village, you talk like everybody else, but when you go to the big cities, you just have to learn to talk different, a little more refined, and I wasn't very refined. I think I could get by if I went back there, but there's so many things that I have to really stop and think or dig out a dictionary for. I have one Japanese friend. She's a Nisei, really. She was born in California, but she lives in Minnesota. And she comes through Oklahoma quite often. She used to live in Kingfisher at one time. And her husband was a lion tamer, or rather wild animal tamer. And we met in Japan. He had his act there. So when we came to Oklahoma, we were surprised to find him living in Kingfisher and having an act out at the zoo every summer. So we made, friends again there. And he's dead now, but she's an artist. And she travels to Arizona for the winters and goes back to Minnesota and Wisconsin for the summers. And she stops by, and when she comes by, we start talking in Japanese. And she has to tell me a lot of things, because I don't remember. I did.
What's her name?
Mary Clemens. And do you know Bob Jenny? He lives outside of Oklahoma City.
Yeah, I know that.
He used to be the curator at the zoo in Oklahoma City.
Yes.
He knows her really well. She has friends in Oklahoma City that she stays with. And she does this fast brush. She calls herself the fastest brush in the north, south, east, and west is what she calls herself. But she does. She stands there and does this quick painting, this fast painting. And there's some work here of hers. Those pictures are hers.
Oh, yeah.
There.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And she goes around. I think she supports herself with this. But we have a lot of fun. I call her my big sister. But she knows the dialect of Nagasaki and Fukuoka. So.
Well, I think we have a good interview. Anything else?
No, I can't. There are so many little things that will probably pop up in my mind afterwards. I will say this though. The Japanese people, if you have met any of them, were the kindest, most courteous people that I think you could meet anywhere in the world.
To Japan twice.
A lot of them have changed though. I know I was shocked after the war when I first went on a streetcar, I think it was. The children, or the young people, not the children, but the teenagers, adolescents, they were not the courteous and kind people that they used to be. Somehow, I think the idea of democracy kind of got distorted in their minds. But you wouldn't have found any woman, elderly person, or a pregnant woman on a train or a streetcar that had to stand up before the war. After the war, it was different. And on my first trip north in 1946, early 1946, I went to Tokyo to get my passport changed, a new passport, because it had expired. And when we got to Osaka, I was just shocked. I sat in this train, and the soldiers who were coming home were trying to get on the trains, and they could see that the trains were filled. The aisles were jammed. And if you locked the door so that they couldn't come in, they would break the windows in. And I never saw anything like that being done before the war. The war just changes people, I think. So maybe now it's different. I don't know.
Did you get to Kyoto?
Yes,
Yes,
I
I
went
love
to
Kyoto.
Kyoto,
That's-
and you know, when I got to Kyoto, I stopped there overnight because my mother had told me about Kyoto, and I just had to see it for myself. And there was no place that I could find to stay the night, and I didn't know what to do. So I went to this little kobansho. It's a little hut. The policemen stay there. It's a little police station. That's what it is. They call it a kobansho. And I went there and I told them that I had come from Fukuoka and that I couldn't find a hotel. And one of the policemen got on the telephone and called and called and called everybody he knew, I think. And finally he found a room for me, and the other policeman got on his bicycle, took my bag, and pedaled slowly because I was walking, and took me to this hotel. And the people are different. Gosh, even the way the men talk, they're so gentle. And it really surprised me. And my mother used to tell me, in Kyoto you could go in the store, and even if there's nobody in the store, you can take what you want, leave your money. They trust you. And then I got to Tokyo, and I found it was different altogether. The first place I went to was the police station, because I couldn't find a place to stay. And he said, well, you have to go. We can't get your place. You can go find your own place. And I went and found it. But Tokyo was such a mess, and Kyoto had still, they hadn't touched it, so it was still so nice.
Yeah, I met a secretary there, and she gave me a guide or two of all of Kyoto.
Oh, yeah.
I enjoyed
They say if you go to Japan, that's one place you have to go, but I think Kyushu is just as nice. I'm partial to Kyushu, the southern part.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go to Unzen. It's so beautiful. There's a golf course if you like golf. But you have to watch out, the crows will steal your ball. They did. They swooped down and
Two
steal
places
it.
I like best, of course they're together, was Kyoto and Nara.
Nara is nice too. I never stopped there, but Kobe is nice too. But I don't like Osaka. They call Osaka the Chicago of Japan. It's where all the gangsters hide out.
Well, I want to thank you for the interview. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Yes.